She had no idea the man she just humiliated built the very career she was standing on. She built her name on being the smartest person in every room she ever entered. She never once looked twice at the man mopping the floor beside her. That mistake would end up costing her everything she thought she'd earned, and she would understand how wrong she had been before the class even stopped laughing. This is the story of Diane Whitfield, a woman who spent 20 years proving she belonged at the top of her field, and Paul Reed, a man who spent the same 20 years being told he didn't belong anywhere near it. Neither of them knew, on the morning this story begins, that their two lives had already been tangled together for 2 decades. Neither of them knew that a single equation, written on a whiteboard as a joke, was about to unravel a secret that had been buried since before either of them had anything to lose. By the time this is over, you will understand why the woman standing at that podium, holding a plaque that did not have her name on it, was crying in front of the very department she had spent her whole career trying to impress. You will understand why the man she once humiliated in front of 80 students never said a single word in his own defense. And you will understand why some people choose silence not because they have nothing to say, but because they are waiting for the one moment when the truth will finally matter. Before I take you into that classroom, do one thing for me. Type in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. I go through every single one, and I respond personally. Then hit subscribe and share it with somebody who needs to hear it, because there's a moment coming in this story that changes everything you think you understand about who deserves to be underestimated. If you can already feel there's more to this than one bad joke, stay with me. Paul Reed had not always been a man who mopped floors after dark. 24 years earlier, he had been one of the most promising doctoral students the mathematics department had ever seen, the kind of mind that professors quietly bragged about at conferences when they thought no one else was listening. He filled notebooks with proofs before he was old enough to rent a car without a surcharge. His advisor at the time, a respected and celebrated professor named Harold Simmons, had once told a room full of colleagues that Paul would be the one to put their university on the map. For a while, it looked like Simmons was right. Paul worked through the nights in a cramped office 2 doors down from his advisors, chasing a single unsolved problem that had frustrated mathematicians for decades. And late one winter, working alone, he found the answer. In the days before he brought his proof to Simmons, Paul noticed small things he didn't think much of at the time. Simmons had grown distant in their weekly meetings, quicker to change the subject whenever Paul mentioned how close he was to finishing. A fellow graduate student, a friend named Terrence, had pulled him aside once in the hallway and told him, only half joking, to be careful who he showed his best work to first. Paul had laughed it off. Simmons had mentored him for 3 years. He had no reason to believe the man who taught him everything he knew about rigor and proof would be the one to take it from him. He did not know yet that finding it would cost him everything. He brought the proof to Simmons first, the way any student would bring a breakthrough to the man who had guided them there. Simmons read it twice, said very little, and asked Paul to leave the notebook with him overnight so he could review the notation more carefully. Paul agreed without hesitation. He trusted the man. He had no reason not to. That single decision, made in good faith on an ordinary evening, would quietly unravel the next 2 decades of his life, though he would not understand how or why for a very long time. 3 weeks later, Paul was called into the department chair's office and told that a formal complaint had been filed against him. Academic dishonesty, the letter said. Falsified research. The complaint carried Harold Simmons' signature at the bottom, along with a claim that Paul had submitted work that was not entirely his own. Paul asked to see the evidence. He was told the matter was already under review and that he would be notified of the outcome. He never was. Weeks turned into a hearing he was barely allowed to speak at, and the hearing turned into a quiet, official end to his doctoral career, delivered in a manila envelope that offered no explanation beyond a single paragraph of dismissal. He tried, at first, to fight it. He wrote letters. He requested meetings. He asked, again and again, for someone to simply look at the original notebook, the one with his own handwriting, dated and time-stamped in the margins the way careful mathematicians always date their work. No one ever produced that notebook again. It had vanished from department records, if it had ever been entered into them at all. Paul was 34 years old, unemployed, quietly blacklisted by whispers he never got to hear directly, and slowly realizing that fighting a respected, tenured professor with the full weight of the university behind him was not a fight he was equipped to win. 6 months after Simmons published a paper introducing what he called a groundbreaking new framework, the same framework Paul had shown him in that notebook, the department chair who had signed off on Paul's dismissal retired quietly, with an endowed chair named in his honor. Paul watched it happen from a distance, working odd jobs to cover rent, his marriage buckling under the financial strain no one around him fully understood the cause of. He never told his wife what had actually happened. He never told anyone. He simply stopped talking about mathematics altogether, as if the subject itself had betrayed him rather than the man who taught it to him. By the time Diane Whitfield walked into that same department 9 years ago, hungry and ambitious and determined to make a name for herself, Harold Simmons was already a legend. His framework was taught in textbooks. His name was on a hallway plaque. Diane had built the better part of her own academic career extending his work, publishing papers that leaned on his foundation, citing him in nearly everything she wrote. She had no reason to question any of it. Why would she? The story she had been told, the story everyone had been told, was clean, uncomplicated, and entirely believable. She simply did not know there was another version of it, one that had been quietly buried in a filing cabinet, waiting for the right person to finally open the drawer. Diane, for her part, had clawed her way into her position the hard way, and she never let anyone forget it. She had grown up watching her mother work 2 jobs to keep the lights on, had been the first in her family to walk across a college graduation stage, and had promised herself early on that she would never again be underestimated by anyone in a position of power over her. That promise had shaped her into an excellent mathematician, but it had also shaped something harder in her, a tendency to look for weakness in others before they could find it in her first. She ran her classroom the way she had been taught to survive graduate school herself, with sharp edges and very little patience for anyone she perceived as beneath her intellectually. She rarely noticed the custodial staff. Not out of cruelty, she would have told you, but simply because they existed in a different orbit than she did, moving through the building at hours she was never fully present for. Paul had been cleaning that same wing of the mathematics building for almost 11 years by the time Diane arrived, and in all that time, she had never once asked him his name. He knew hers. He knew the names of most of the faculty, quietly, the way people who feel invisible often learn to notice everything about the people who overlook them. He watched Diane's career rise year after year, publication after publication, each one built a little further on a foundation he alone knew the true origin of. He never said a word. Not because he did not care anymore, though there were long stretches of years when he genuinely believed he had stopped caring, but because he had learned, painfully, exactly what happened to men like him when they tried to speak the truth to people who held all the power in the room. So instead, he did his job. He arrived early. He left late. He kept his old notebook, the second one, the one he had rebuilt entirely from memory in the years after the first one disappeared, hidden in the same worn canvas bag he carried to work every single day, as if some part of him always knew that one day, somehow, it might matter again. Diane arrived to teach her mid-morning class the way she always did, 10 minutes early, coffee in hand, already scanning the room for anything or anyone she could use to make a point. It had become something of a running joke among her students, the kind of bit that grew a small following on campus long before anyone thought to film it. Whenever Diane wanted to make an example out of how hard her subject truly was, she would turn, without warning, to whichever custodian happened to be working nearby, and ask them to solve something absurdly difficult on the whiteboard, as if the punchline had always been obvious. Nobody ever expected an answer. That was the entire point of the joke. The janitor was never supposed to actually know. That particular morning, Diane was not in the mood for jokes, though she did not fully realize it herself. She had spent the previous 4 nights staring at the same unfinished proof, an extension of her own published research that refused to resolve no matter how many angles she tried. It was the kind of stall that quietly terrifies an academic under pressure, the kind that makes tenure committees start asking pointed questions in hallway conversations. So when she turned to the whiteboard that morning, chalk in hand, some exhausted, frustrated part of her decided to write the actual unsolved extension itself, not as a lesson for her students, but as a private, bitter joke aimed at no one in particular. Paul happened to be near the back corner of the room, restocking supplies, the same way he had 100 times before during her lectures. Diane turned toward him without thinking, the old habit taking over completely. "Since you're already here," she said, loud enough for the room to hear, chalk still in her hand, "why don't you show us how it's done?" A ripple of laughter moved through the students. Phones quietly angled upward. This was the moment they always waited for, the punchline nobody expected to actually land. Paul set down the box he was carrying, walked toward the board without a word, and picked up the chalk Diane had left resting in the tray. The room went quiet almost instantly, the kind of quiet that comes from genuine surprise rather than staged anticipation. Paul studied the equation for a moment, his eyes moving across it the way a person reads something achingly familiar rather than something new. Then he began to write, calm and unhurried, his handwriting small and precise, filling the board with a method none of the students had ever been taught, one that seemed to sidestep the exact wall Diane had been stuck against for 4 sleepless nights. Diane stood frozen near her desk, coffee forgotten in her hand, watching a man she had never once asked the name of solve, before she had even sat back down, the exact problem that had been quietly unraveling her career. If you're still with me, thank you for staying this far. Drop a comment and tell me what you think Diane is going to find next. Diane did not sleep that night, and it had nothing to do with the coffee she kept refilling in an attempt to justify still being in her office at midnight. She kept the photo of the whiteboard open on her laptop screen, zoomed in on Paul's handwriting, the small precise loops of his numbers, the particular way he crossed his sevens. It nagged at her in a way she could not immediately name, the same low, persistent unease of recognizing a voice on the phone before you can place whose it is. She told herself it was nothing. Coincidence. A method he had picked up somewhere, taught himself, watched in a lecture he happened to sit in on once. She almost believed it, until she remembered exactly where she had seen handwriting like that before. Diane had inherited a small collection of boxed research materials 3 years earlier, shortly after Harold Simmons passed away, materials the department had asked her to sort through as the informal keeper of his legacy. She had barely gone through them at the time, overwhelmed by her own workload, and had simply stored the boxes in the back corner of a supply closet down the hall from her office. That night, unable to shake the feeling clawing at the edge of her memory, she walked down to that closet at nearly 1 in the morning and started pulling folders at random, searching for something she could not yet name, only recognize once she found it. She found it in the 3rd folder she opened. A stack of loose pages, yellowed at the edges, filled with the same small, careful handwriting she had watched fill her whiteboard hours earlier. The same cross sevens, the same distinctive way of writing a summation sign, slightly wider at the base than convention usually called for. Her hands went cold before her mind caught up to what she was looking at. These were not Simmons' notes. She had seen enough of his actual handwriting over the years to know that immediately. Someone else had written these pages decades ago, and somehow they had ended up here, buried in a box labeled with Harold Simmons' name. One of Diane's students, a sharp second year named Aisha Coleman who had filmed the original whiteboard moment for a class group chat, couldn't stop thinking about the look on Paul's face that day. It hadn't looked like a man solving a stranger's problem. It had looked like recognition. On her own time, without telling Diane, Aisha started pulling old departmental newsletters from the university archive, cross-referencing faculty publication credits by hand. She found a footnote in a 20-year-old academic journal, a citation crediting Harold Simmons for work developed independently, dated only months after a graduate student's abrupt withdrawal from the program. She brought the footnote to Diane's office unannounced, nervous, half expecting to be dismissed. Diane didn't dismiss her. She sat Aisha down and told her, for the first time, what she suspected. It was Aisha's small, careful piece of digging that gave Diane the confidence to keep pulling the thread instead of quietly letting it go. The following morning, Diane did something she had never once done in 9 years of walking past him in the hallway. She looked up Paul Reed's personnel file. It took almost no effort at all, a simple request to human resources, the kind of routine inquiry no one questions when it comes from a tenured faculty member. What she found unsettled her more than the handwriting had. Paul had once been a doctoral student in her own department, enrolled under Harold Simmons himself, until a formal complaint ended his academic career abruptly in his mid-30s. The complaint cited falsified research. The file was thin, oddly thin for something serious enough to end a promising career, missing the kind of supporting documentation such a case should have generated. Diane's search nearly stalled twice. The first time, she requested the original complaint file from the registrar's office and was told it had been purged per standard retention policy, a phrase that meant nothing and everything at once. The second time, an old memo surfaced naming a different graduate student entirely, someone who had left the program around the same time as Paul, and for one unsettling week Diane believed she had the wrong man's story altogether. It was only Eleanor, again, who clarified that the other student's departure was unrelated, a quiet reminder that not everyone who disappears from a department has a stolen breakthrough behind them. She reached out, carefully, to a retired administrative assistant named Eleanor Voss, a woman who had worked in the department for nearly 40 years before retiring and who still lived close enough to campus to meet Diane for coffee. Eleanor remembered Paul immediately, her expression shifting the moment his name came up, something between sadness and old, unspoken guilt crossing her face. That whole situation never sat right with me, Eleanor admitted quietly, stirring her coffee without drinking it. Professor Simmons pushed that complaint through faster than I'd ever seen one move. Barely any paperwork. I always wondered what really happened to that boy's original notebook. Diane felt something tighten in her chest, the shape of a question she was not yet ready to fully ask out loud. Diane found Paul at the end of his shift, waiting near the loading dock where the custodial staff clocked out, the folder of old research pages tucked under her arm, like something fragile she wasn't sure she was allowed to be carrying. He looked at the folder before he looked at her face, and something in his posture told her he already knew exactly what she had found. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Diane simply asked him the question she had been circling for 2 days. Whose handwriting is this? Paul studied her for a while, the way a man studies someone deciding whether they've earned the truth yet. Finally, he reached into his worn canvas bag and pulled out a second notebook, older, more careworn than the pages she was holding. He opened it slowly, turning it so she could see the pages filled edge to edge with the same small, precise handwriting, dated entries stretching back further than she could have imagined, each one witnessed and signed the way careful researchers protect their own work. I rebuilt it, Paul said quietly, after the first one disappeared. Took me almost 3 years to recreate everything I lost, working nights after my shifts ended. Diane felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her as the pieces finally locked into place, no longer scattered fragments, but a single, devastating shape. The framework she had spent her entire career extending, the one bearing Harold Simmons' name on a hallway plaque, had never belonged to him at all. Paul told her the rest plainly, without bitterness, though the weight of 20 years sat in every word. How he had brought his breakthrough to Simmons in good faith. How Simmons had asked to review it overnight and never returned the original. How a fabricated complaint had ended his academic career within weeks. How the notebook had vanished from every official record. How he had spent years trying to be heard by people who had already decided his voice did not matter. He told her about the marriage that had buckled under the financial collapse that followed, about the friends who slowly stopped calling as the shame settled into him. It was never his shame to carry, but it changed him, made him harder to reach, harder to be around. He told her he had taken the custodial job because it was steady, because it let him stay near the field he still loved without ever having to touch it directly again. Her name was Renee. She had stayed as long as she could, through the unemployment, through Paul's silence about what had actually happened, through years of watching a man she loved slowly stop being able to talk about the thing he used to love most. She never left because she stopped caring. She left because she couldn't keep loving someone who wouldn't let her see the wound clearly enough to help him heal it. They hadn't spoken in almost 12 years. Diane sat down on the edge of the loading dock, the folder still in her lap, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not know what to say. Everything she had built, every paper, every citation, every ounce of recognition that had carried her toward tenure, rested on a foundation that had been stolen from the man standing in front of her in a work uniform. She thought about her mother working 2 jobs, about the promise she had made herself never to be looked past by anyone in power. And she realized, with a kind of quiet horror, that she had spent years walking past this exact man without ever once wondering what he might be carrying. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" she finally asked, her voice smaller than she intended. Paul closed the notebook gently, the way someone closes something they've protected for a very long time. "Because I tried once," he said, "and it cost me everything. I wasn't willing to lose what little I had left a second time." The honesty in that answer landed harder than any accusation could have. Diane looked down at the folder in her lap, then back up at him, and understood, clearly, that the only real question left was not what had happened 20 years ago, but what she was willing to do about it now that she knew. There was a night, not long after their conversation on the loading dock, when Paul asked Diane to let it go. He told her he had built something small and steady out of the wreckage of his old life, and he was afraid of what it would cost him to tear that open again in public. "I don't know if I can survive losing something twice," he admitted. It was Diane, this time, who pushed back, telling him that silence had already cost him 20 years, and that she wasn't willing to let it cost him the rest. Diane's public admission did not happen quickly, and it did not happen quietly. She spent weeks after that conversation on the loading dock gathering evidence, cross-referencing dates, tracking down old faculty who remembered fragments of what had happened 20 years earlier, building a case not to protect herself, but to protect Paul from being disbelieved the way he had been the first time. She brought everything to the department chair, laid it out methodically, the original notebook pages, the timeline, Eleanor's account, the handwriting analysis she had quietly commissioned from an outside expert just to remove any doubt. She made it impossible to look away from. Not everyone welcomed what Diane was doing. A senior member of the tenure committee warned her privately that unraveling Simmons' legacy would unravel the credibility of everything built on top of it, including her own body of work. Simmons' family, through the estate's legal counsel, initially pushed back on any public correction, citing his standing and asking the university to handle the matter quietly, internally, without press. Diane refused to back down, and it was that refusal, more than the evidence itself, that ultimately forced the university's hand. The university moved carefully, the way institutions always do when their own history is the thing being questioned, but eventually, the truth proved too solid to bury a second time. A formal review was opened. Harold Simmons' estate and legacy committee were notified. The framework that had carried his name in textbooks for 2 decades was quietly, then publicly, recredited, his contribution acknowledged only where it had genuinely existed, with Paul Reed's name restored beside it for the very first time. The university offered Paul an honorary doctorate in recognition of work that had, in every meaningful sense, already been his degree 20 years earlier. He accepted, on the condition that the ceremony be small and that no one frame it as a scandal. This brings us back to where this story began. Diane, standing at that podium, holding a plaque that carried a name that was not her own, her voice unsteady as she told a room full of colleagues and students exactly what she had learned. She did not spare herself in the telling. She spoke plainly about the years she had spent building a career on a foundation she never once thought to question, about the countless times she had walked past Paul without knowing his name, let alone what he carried. It was not a speech asking for forgiveness. It was simply the truth, finally spoken out loud, in the same building where it had been buried for so long. Aisha sat near the back of the room that day too, the same phone in her pocket that had once filmed a joke played for laughs, now filming something she actually wanted to remember. Diane singled her out briefly during her remarks, telling the room that a curious student who refused to let a small inconsistency go was the reason any of this had come to light at all. It was a small mention, but for Aisha, who had spent her whole first year feeling like just another face in a lecture hall, it landed like the first time anyone had told her that paying close attention actually mattered. Paul sat in the front row that day, the worn canvas bag resting beside his feet, the same one that had carried his rebuilt notebook through 2 decades of quiet, unnoticed shifts. When the university later offered him a research position, one that would let him finally return to the work he had lost 2 decades earlier, he accepted that too. He began teaching a small seminar the following semester, and on the first day, as he stood at the front of a lecture hall for the first time in 20 years, he looked out and saw Diane sitting quietly in the back row, notebook open, taking notes like any other student in the room. A letter arrived at his apartment 2 weeks after the ceremony made local news. Renee had seen his name in a small university press release and recognized it immediately. She didn't ask for anything. She only wrote that she was proud of him, and that she finally understood what he had been carrying alone all those years. Paul read the letter 3 times before he called the number she'd included. It would take months of careful, uncertain conversation before they were anything close to what they once were. But for the first time in over a decade, he let himself believe that some things lost to silence could still, eventually, be found again. Months later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, Paul stood on Renee's porch holding a small bouquet he had picked out with more care than he'd put into anything in years. She opened the door before he could knock a second time, and for a moment neither of them said a word, just stood there taking in how much time had changed them both. They spent that afternoon on her porch swing, talking the way they used to before the silence took over, about nothing important and everything that mattered. When he finally stood to leave, she reached for his hand and told him she wasn't ready to say goodbye just yet. It wasn't the marriage they once had, not right away, but it was something honest, something neither of them was willing to let slip through their fingers a second time. She spent her whole career trying to be the smartest person in every room she ever entered. She never once noticed that the smartest person in the room had been cleaning it the entire time. And somewhere in this story, in the space between a joke made carelessly on an ordinary morning and a truth uncovered 20 years too late, there is a question worth sitting with long after this video ends. Would you have recognized what he was showing you? Or would you have laughed along with everyone else? If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs a good story tonight. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.